Well, welcome everyone to the panel. And it looks like we might be having the same kind of intimate conversation we got to have last week when the panelists met together to chat about what we were going to be talking about today. So I'll start out. I'm Christina Botta, and I'm here. I'm joining you from McMaster University, where I work, and both McMaster and I live on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee people, and of course, ongoing territories. This is, of course, like many of us, especially who are in the GTA, land that is protected by the Dishwitwen's Boom Wampum, which calls us to be in right relation with the land. And I've been reflecting a lot on Darlene LaForme's introductory remarks to this conference that was asking us to really take time and think, and also really about the discussions we've been having about sovereignty and the responsibilities that I as a white settler have in both working against colonialism and its legacies, about learning, about listening, and also really for thinking about sovereignty and calling on my government to be in right relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. So we'll kind of work through in our introductions with the various folks to sort of locate ourselves. But I did want to sort of introduce this panel and our wonderful panelists we have today, who are all folks who love music. I think we've all worked in different areas as musicians or music makers, or in the way of musicking, and are also thinking about policy at the local and up to national levels. And we've engaged in with music and thinking critically through music in these different ways. And it starts out by asking about the impact of the pandemic on Canadian music making, music institutions and industries, as well as musical livelihoods. And we're especially interested in how musicians and music communities are responding, and also how policy at the local, provincial, and national levels could do better. But of course, we're very conscious of the fact that it's not that the pandemic is only one of many crises to hit musicians and music makers and music communities. And so we want to be thinking almost through three temporalities today: the before times, the pandemic, and the future, being very aware of the ways that inequalities and problems have always been shaping and making contingent the lives and livelihoods of musicians. So we're going to start out by taking turns locating ourselves biographically in this musical landscape that we're sort of sketching out here, and thinking about ourselves as doers, makers, and thinkers. So, we're also going to be sharing some links to projects that we might be working on, whether they're, related to scholarship. And I'm turning on the live transcript right now. And okay, so there we go. It's turned on. Thank you, Margita. So thinking about how we're located and can respond. So I think I'll leave off there. I guess I will locate myself as, mostly I'm a professor, and I talk about music and audio technologies and stardom, but I also sometimes moonlight as a clarinetist and bass clarinetist, and that occasionally wanders out into the world. So I will turn things over to the next person. We'll go maybe alphabetically by last name, to Dr. Mark Campbell from the University of Toronto.
Thank you, Dr. Bade. I am located actually right now in the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of Lake Scugog, which is just outside of the University of Toronto campus, University of Toronto Scarborough campus. And I am a professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and a curator and DJ, and sort of work between all those spaces. I would like to think with equal vigor, but I know right now the artistic practice is suffering as the end of the school year kind of devours the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thanks. And moving on, going again alphabetically by last name, to Dr. Brian Photo from the University of Alberta.
Hi, everyone. Good morning / afternoon. I'm here coming from Treaty 6 territory, or Edmonton, from my basement, and I'm an assistant professor of popular music studies and media studies here. Over the last few years, I've been working with some colleagues on a project looking at issues of artists making a living in the digital era. We've been involved in some hearings and submitting briefs to processes of copyright review taking place here in Canada. Perhaps I'll send some links to those briefs a little later on. I play the drums as well and have played in various bands over the years, mostly just as side projects and things, never as the primary thing that I've done. But I've found that it's an interesting thing to pair with research into the music industries.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. Next is Dr. Casey Messia, who's at York University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Messia, and I'm currently located in the area known as Tkaronto, which has been taken care by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at York University. I'm also an interdisciplinary artist, primarily doing work in music and film. Between roughly 2004 and 2014, I was the lead singer of a 7-piece orchestral pop band called Obiju, and I released a solo album called Psychic Materials in 2016. I've sat on a number of music grant juries and have consulted with arts organizations on issues of equity. I consider myself a theorist of sound, diaspora, and cultural production, and intrinsic to my academic research is my experience as a musician. So thank you to the organizing committee for having me, and to my fellow panelists for sharing in today's conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Casey. We now move on to Dr. Laura Risk at the University of Toronto.
Thanks. I'm coming to you on Zoom from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, and so a meeting place for many First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples here. I'm in the same department as Mark Campbell, Arts, Culture, and Media at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and my focus, I'd say my focus until the pandemic was on traditional music in Quebec. I'm also a musician. Prior to my academic life, I was a working musician. I still am a working musician. A lot of touring, recording, teaching, the general musical freelance lifestyle. And with the pandemic, with pretty much the almost total devastation of that. Sorry, there's something. Oh, I see we're all being spotlighted. Okay, thank you. With the almost total devastation of the I'd say the independent music industry, or the touring and performing, my research took a bit of a turn, and I started working on a project about the impact of the pandemic on musicians and musical communities. And I'm just finishing up co-editing a triple special issue of Critical Studies and Improvisation on that topic. So the first volume is out, it's one special issue. The second volume will probably be out next week. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. So a fair amount of what I'll have to say today will probably be coming out of that work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Laura. And last but certainly not least is Ms. Alana Stewart, who is joining us, who is a musician and thinker about music, who is joining us from Toronto.
Hello, my name is Alana Stewart. Like Casey, I'm located in what we identify as Toronto, Tkaronto. I'm also an interdisciplinary artist, but I primarily identify as a music maker, as a producer, an audio engineer, songwriter, and a vocalist. And all those slashes in my name are important. My sounds and how I identify emerge as my experience or emerged from my experience as a Black woman creating music in the popular music sector. My main projects are Bonje, which is a hybrid sound rooted in Jamaican dancehall culture. So lots of heavy, heavy bass and pummeling kick, but mixed with the vocal vulnerability of artists like Feist or esoteric nature of artists like Kate Bush. I'm also a vocalist in the Queer Songbook Orchestra, which presents queer stories and hidden queer histories of popular music interspersed with songs in live music, and most recently have begun expanding my solo practice as Pine. And all of those sounds are hybrid sounds and reflections of the multiplicity of my identity as a second generation Caribbean Canadian child of immigrants, as well as the daughter of a foster mother. So much of my work is inspired by a feeling of being an outsider, even within my own home, and trying to find a place for sounds and expressions that emerge from in-betweenness. So that's the what. More recently, I became an accidental academic, and all the implications of those tasks, those tenets of my identity inspired an exploration into understanding my place in the music industry, more specifically looking at this term diversity that is thrown around in the music industry and celebrated, but doesn't have a clear understanding of how that guides how we work, who we work with, how we value the ideas within the music industry, et cetera. So I've been doing qualitative research, understanding how diversity works within the Canadian independent music scene, and also researching diversity and innovation within the music industry and all the socio-political, the human complexities that feed those terms. And that information has formed the why, has reinforced the why of the music that I'm making. And I'll elaborate more on those projects and how that has impacted how I operated in the pandemic, pre-pandemic and post. So I'm a music maker and I'm a thinker, and my name's Alana.
Thanks so much, Alana. So you have a sense of where we're coming from. As you can see, we're engaged with a range of different locations in Canada, a range of different genres and scenes, as we love to say in music studies. And I want to take up this theme that was coming up in the conversations that we were having leading up to this panel, which is this idea about sustainability, and something that we talk about for both music making, but also for musicians, and how we negotiate these institutional, industrial, and regulatory structures, and also the ways that this concept of sustainability, this experience of trying to sustain music communities and musicians, is so raced, gendered, shaped by class and disability. And so I guess I want to start by asking this very simply framed, but very challenging and complicated question. When we talk about sustainability in relation to music making, what do we mean?
I mean, I could take a stab at it and hopefully it'll open up some more thinking around this concept. I think this is an important provocation, and it's one that necessarily structures how we might imagine a future for music in all its forms and for all of its players. I think there are some key inquiries that ground my thinking around the meaning of sustainability, though I do think that the meanings are flexible and contingent on who and where we are physically and socially located. So Christina, you gestured to this a little bit, but sustainability is generally understood as the capability of something being maintained, or it's associated with the avoidance of the depletion of a resource. So using those definitions as perhaps a starting point, some important questions and provocations come to mind. So, is music a resource? And if so, what value does it bring to the quality of human life? Is it in a state of depletion? If so, is it only in the state because the creation of music has become tied to capital accumulation? Does sustainability refer to the trading of sound for money as a means of maintaining a livelihood? Is sustainability linked to remuneration? And if so, what is sacrificed in the exchange? Or what communities of sound, makers of sound, and infrastructures of music go unnoticed or unrecognized because of this exchange? Or what communities go unnoticed because they operate outside or resist this lure of capitalism? Is the goal to get paid? And if so, how is this done equitably? Or are we thinking about environmental sustainability and the environmental consequences of the music industry itself? For example, in 2017, Coachella, this big festival in the States, generated 107 tons of waste per day, 20% of which was recyclable. So music creation, performance, and the infrastructures required for digital streaming leave this enormous carbon footprint. So are we imagining sustainability within a consideration of continued environmental degradation? Are we talking about the sustainability of music education, music infrastructures such as granting systems or regulatory bodies? So for example, how might music education, which has proven mental health benefits, be sustained if someone like Doug Ford continues to cut from education? In 2021, the Ford government confirmed that they'd be cutting 1.6 billion from education, which includes music education. So if we're thinking about sustainability in this realm, then it seems that any policy should be oriented towards safeguarding funds to ensure music education and the quality of that education is equitably distributed across school boards. And I won't ramble on too long, but it seems all of these questions are entangled. But I think for us to have a meaningful conversation, which doesn't float in vagueness or redundancies, because this conversation is not new. In fact, many of us on this panel have had this conversation multiple times before. We need to narrow down or narrow in on what we are chatting about. So as a musician who has toured for over a decade, music has never offered me financial sustainability, nor did I ever imagine it to. This is not to say that I didn't hope that it would, but I was always cognizant that I wasn't going to sell a lot of records, nor did I create music that would fit within a popular imaginary, or my music wouldn't have been rendered profitable. And this speaks to the ways that sustainability is indeed race, gendered, and classed, and that ideas of sustainability or financial sustainability are loaded with exclusions. And I guess my prevailing concerns are around the socio-political implications of sustainability and what potentially gets reproduced when advocating for it. I mean, there's a lot there, and I rambled, but I think I have more questions than I have answers for this particular, line of inquiry. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Casey. I think you've really sort of laid the ground for us, talking about these concepts about, livelihood for musicians, these issues about music as a social good, which I think is implicit in that sort of role of education, the very important, and ongoing, probably the way we use sustainability most in terms of the environment, and, the ways that you've been bringing capital and unequal access to resources and support. And, obviously these are all really valuable threads to be pulling up, and I appreciate the way that you're asking for specificity. And I know that many of us have been thinking and working on these questions in really specific ways. And I wonder if somebody else wants to jump in with their thoughts about that.
I can just quickly maybe say a little bit about how our project has looked at issues of sustainability within kind of the context of Canada, when so much of the music industries are sort of dictated by global corporations. And a lot of what we've been talking about or looking at is what it means for heightened industry concentration and things like the monopolization of the music industries for things like earning a living, but also for thinking about diverse and equitable music infrastructure, things like venues, how grants are allocated. And some of the stats we've been looking at are that, and some of you may be familiar with these sorts of stats too, but In 2017, the US music industry generated $43 billion and artists received 12% of that. And within that 12%, 1% of artists accounted for 77% of all recorded music income in around 2014. And in 2020, the top 1% was accounting for 90% of streams, and the top 10% of artists accounted for 99.4%. So we're looking at what that means for the artists outside of that, even looking at the Canadian industries from across 2005 to 2017. Drake, The Weeknd, and Justin Bieber have dominated. They have the top 8 most streamed songs of Canadian musicians, 31 of the top 50, and 72 of the top 150. So sometimes people will point to the fact that there is a vibrant and healthy record industry or music industry in Canada, but it's often pointing to the stats that show that there's these 3 major players in the industry. But also things like we've been focused on what it means for artists in Edmonton and Winnipeg. Many have to leave to go to places like Toronto to get their careers going. Half of Factor grant money over about the last 10 years has gone to Ontario musicians, despite the province having less than 40% of the population. So there's that need to sort of be located in 1 or 2 or 3 centers. So we have some recommendations we've been working through with respect to what we might do moving forward or think about moving forward with respect to how policy might play out. But I think I'll just stop there for now and let some others sort of get in there and talk about this topic of sustainability.
If I can jump in, thank you both for introducing such a broad spectrum of what sustainability means. It helps me feel a little bit less personally responsible for my contribution as an artist to maintaining the music industry when I'm so aware of the systems that are guiding my own efforts. But I did want to ground the idea of sustainability in the personal and in the self, because there's so much I think weight put on the systems, the power of systems and how they guide how we live. But when I think about sustainability, I think about the maintenance of self, emotional health, mental health, even the idea of identity. And I'm thinking about this in the context of the pandemic. And just to anchor, my contributions to the conversation, I do work in the academic world, but I'm going to be anchoring it in my experience as an artist, as a music lover, as a person. So I'll be speaking anecdotally and might introduce some academic theory just to make it seem like I know what I'm talking about. So when I think about sustainability, I think about the maintenance of self. And especially with music, it's like we're people making music for the consumption of other people. And so I really am concerned about how do I avoid burnout? How do I maintain my identity as an artist in the face of the realistic adult responsibilities of having to pay rent? When I think about wanting to be a good person and wanting to make a contribution to the world, how do I maintain my value system? How do I maintain my morality as an artist operating within a music industry and all the capitalistic or the economic implications of that? And so I guess I don't really have an answer, but a personal curiosity is how do I maintain a self in the face of all these systems and all the obstacles and barriers that are presented? And what are the opportunities to, we're talking about sustainability, but another question that comes up is what are we sustaining? What is it that we're maintaining? But with the pandemic, there's an opportunity to question what has been sustained that we want to actually dismantle. And so that's a curiosity that I'd like to introduce. And I'm sure that as we speak more, there are different artistic practices and also artist initiatives that have sought to do the opposite of maintaining, but to break down the very systems that we've brought up.
I'd like to.
Oh, go
Go
ahead,
on.
Mark.
I was you muted yourself so quickly. Now I'm thrown into the spotlight. Thank you. I was going to riff off of Lana's piece, just really thinking about at the level of discourse, right? Like, so taking it outside of even music communities. And, you know, I was thinking as I'm doing research and, you know, staying up on what's happening in the music world since the pandemic, you know, in the last, I don't even know how long it's been, but musicians have made like $60 million from NFT sales in probably in the last 12 months. And that whole world is kind of exploding. And what's scary about it is that in terms of sustainability is that the conversation is still, there's still two parallel conversations. There's one about look at artists getting rich. And then there's like the very, very fringe folks that are saying, actually the mining of NFTs and the mining of cryptocurrency is, you know, the rate of electricity used is so much higher than so many other things in the world. And then you have like this fraction of avant-garde kind of activist folks unable to penetrate the hype and the sort of the discourse where you'll find like Rolling Stone magazine or Variety magazine will always report on, you know, will report on financial figures, right? Like how and always this kind of hopeful thing of the independent artist. And there's never a moment in the beginning of discourse where there's a coupling of the economic benefits and the sustainability questions or the environmental impact. It always kind of diverges, so that even if you're doing the research, if you could spend all day and learn about how much money, you know, Elon Musk's wife made through an NFT kind of thing. And it would take you like a week before you'd figure out what, you know, what are the gas fees and the mining environmental impacts of NFTing any piece of music. So I find that so problematic at the level of discourse, so that in an academic venue like this, we can zero in on sustainability, but we can barely penetrate major media to start discussing this thing at a level in which we could all learn really quickly. You know, it's actually quite difficult. Laura.
Thanks, Mark. I love this conversation. I guess since I'm the last of the panelists to speak on sustainability, I feel like there's so many important ideas that have come out. I'm going to try to maybe draw some connections and point to some new questions. Casey, I love that you started out with a definition of sustainability as maintaining the status quo, maintaining something. I don't know if we want to call it the status quo, and avoiding the depletion of resources, because that really made me think, do we want to maintain the status quo in music? And I'm not talking about the artistic side here. I'm talking about the financial precarity side. I'm talking about the burnout and the pain, the rent that Alana was mentioning, and these kinds of structures that have come up, I think, across all of this conversation. That Brian really pointed to it, the sort of the big players versus the independents. The fact that when we talk about money in the music industry, we talk about big numbers that are actually a very, very small percentage of people and of companies, of organizations. What is it? The last statistics I saw for self-employment, or we can call it freelancing in the Canadian music industry, were something like 60 to 70%. I actually think that's probably underrepresenting the numbers. That depends who's being surveyed. Another survey I saw that was from the UK said that 92% of the industry is what they called, I think it was individual to small enterprises. I think we can imagine that as a person and their partner running some kind of, you know, music business out of their home, like touring, independent record label, whatever that is they're doing. But that's the industry we're talking about. But what we often hear about in the news and where these big numbers come from is that 8% at the top, or the 10%, or whatever it is. And I think what we've seen in the pandemic is that this the freelancers, the independents, they're sustaining us as a society through what I would call effective labor. I would say unfairly or not compensated effective labor. In other words, essentially sharing music, not just sharing music, but sharing the intimacies of our life, like creating some kind of communal spaces for us to interact at a time when we're not supposed to interact in person. So creating spaces online, creating spaces through music, creating a sense of meaning, and coming together through music, and not being paid for it, except through the emergency funding that we've seen with the pandemic, which in some ways has provided a model for what, say, something like universal basic income might actually offer to musicians, which is the kind of stability that they've never had. So let me put out, maybe I could put out a couple ideas here. Maybe we don't want to maintain the status quo for music. Maybe we don't want to just, maybe the status quo for music is actually the depletion of resources. As streaming revenue go down for artists, but go up for some small segment of the industry. And then as live streaming moves into that space, so now not only is your recorded music providing basically no income, but now your live performances, which are online, are in the same boat because it's donations, it's tips. Who's getting the money from that? Facebook through advertising, YouTube. So maybe we don't want sustainability. Maybe we don't want to maintain that status quo. So I'm just going to put another word out. Maybe we want to work toward thriving instead of sustaining. And what would that look like? And I think that comes not through focusing on the macroeconomics of the industry, but focusing on how we're sustaining communities, local communities, small communities of musicians working within communities, and how musicians are providing human support for communities, and then how we're providing support for musicians to do that. Okay, I'll put that on the table.
Thanks so much, Laura. And I think what all these wise things that people have been saying, I think it really points to the limits of thinking about music in terms of labor and the sort of advocacy for fair payment for musicians, especially if we're looking at, this divide between, we have this kind of split, it seems like, between talking about the sort of affective labor, the kind of communities and embeddedness of musicians in holding up, our feelings of connection and our emotional sustenance, and then these very macro kinds of ways, as people have been saying, as Laura was saying, and others. And so one of the things that did run through our conversation was the sort of framing about community music making and industry. And we were sort of talking and then pushing against the idea whether these are, dichotomous framings or not. But it probably would be a good idea to sort of clarify a little bit more what we mean by this, especially by community music making, and especially thinking about, again, how do individuals negotiate these sorts of lines? And, also thinking about those roles about social justice and diversity work, thinking about, say, how Sarah Ahmed has been talking about diversity work as often descriptive and not necessarily transformational, not necessarily leading to the thriving that Laura has put on the table. So again, would love to hear from folks talking about these questions.
Okay, I'm going to start here so I don't have to go last, because that's the hardest spot. And because when we talked about this last week, I think I was given the job of coming up with a better definition of community music than the one I gave last week. So, and I do teach a course at Scarborough called Exploring Community Music. So I feel like I should have a decent definition. So maybe I'll just put a few ideas out for that, and then pass on the conversation. Community music is a term that has entered the academy fairly recently. And I think often we set it up in opposition to several other things. Sometimes we set up community music in opposition to what we could call, I don't know, conservatory style pre-professional training. Or we could set up community music in opposition to the music industry. And as Christina just said, maybe we don't want to make that separation. And I would agree with that. Community music as an umbrella term gets used in many different contexts. Sometimes it's just used for things like amateur musical activities like community orchestras and community choirs and community bands. So in other words, amateur. Non-professional music making. Sometimes it's used more in a sense of communal music groups. So this is some kind of group that is based around participation, open access. So there's often like an eclectic repertoire, some kind of shared repertoire, but it's more just like, let's create a space and people come together and make music. And again, there tends to be a non-professional focus to that. Sometimes community music gets used as a term for music that's associated with what we'd call, and I'm putting this in quotes, cultural communities, and which raises its own questions about who is not in a cultural community. And that community music, I think, especially is used to refer to music that has some kind of proactive interventionist agenda. So this could be these are sometimes broadly lumped under the phrase of things like a phrase like music for social change. So some kind of musical activity that, say, helping youth stay in school, or working with prison populations, or bringing together groups in a warring country, or so on. Maybe I'd just like to add to all of these ways of thinking about community music as an academic subject, which is one thing that it's become recently, is that I'm not sure that music exists outside of community. I don't know that we have music that's not community music. I don't know that we make music in ways that are not grounded in community. But we tend to focus on individuals. We tend to lift up individuals. But what if we were to lift up communities and look at the place of musicians in those contexts? I'm going to pass it on.
Thanks so much, Laura. Oh, and Ilana, yes, go. I was just
Well,
going to.
I was just thinking about the idea of is there such thing as music outside of community? And I think about new AI generate. I'm like allergic to AI at the moment, but I think about AI generated music. I mean, technically it's music, you know. And I think about the music industry that I came up in. I started working in the music industry at age 14, and it was very formulaic. My development as an artist back then. Canada was very focused on emulating a popular American idea of success, which was very industry driven. And the music that I was creating, the lyrics that I was guided towards writing, the changing of my name in my bio without my knowledge was all driven for industry success. I was creating music. There was no community to be found, but my music managed to find its way through certain pipelines to the radio. And so I think about that, and would that be considered music? Are we talking about like, how are we evaluating music in that sense when I hear music can only kind of exist within community? And then I think about the challenge, a challenge that I brought up earlier of we can have our own personal motivation, but music, which is a thing that's meant to be shared, has to encounter other mindsets, other social norms, value systems, motivations, and what happens to the meaning of that music once it encounters other people or people outside of the the community. And I think that there tends to be an allergic reaction to the word industry, or there can be, it could feel, and this is not a criticism of you, I'm reflecting on my own personal inner tensions and trying to create music that is meaningful, but then also this word sustainability, the idea of trying to sustain a practice, the idea of trying to sustain myself, and the conflict that comes up between industry and community. And I think about what's coming to mind is the Jamaican music industry as a site that has successfully been able to integrate the two or create at the intersection of community and industry. So a bit of background, I mentioned earlier that I'm second generation Caribbean Canadian, a child of immigrants. My father's from Jamaica, and dancehall reggae is music that comes from Jamaica. But it wasn't until 4 years ago that I went to Jamaica for the first time and really encountered the community and the industry, the creative practices that has birthed what I identify as one of the most successful or one of the most innovative creative hubs in the world. And the reason why I bring it up is because Jamaica is a place that punches above its weight culturally, and its music has been co-opted by music industries and scenes around the world, but it's still an economically depleted country. And so I think it's a perfect example of the potential that lies in having community music more actively engage with the music industry, but also is a warning of what happens when it's not done properly, what happens to the music makers that are innovating and creating music out of creating music from community within an industry that exploits. And so, first of all, are you guys following me at the moment? I'm trying to build the case for not having these two ideas of creation and production operate on opposite ends of the aisle, but bringing them together to explore the possibilities of how can we create that thriving at the intersection of the two. And Jamaica, I think, is an example of how that can be. So I'll give you a bit of background on the Jamaican music industry, how it came to be, and why I think that it's a place that we should explore as a site for exploring those possibilities. So the music industry in Jamaica started in community music. It's rooted in sound system culture. A Jamaican sound system is essentially a PA, but it's stacked like 18 feet high. It blasts bass and sound across neighborhoods. And it was created because music was being created by people in marginalized communities of lower socioeconomic status who, because of that socioeconomic status, couldn't get their music on traditional radio. They didn't have that power. So they said, in true Jamaican braggadocio, said, okay, fine, you don't want to play my music on the radio, you're going to hear me anyway. So they created these sound systems and would blast sounds and the community messages across neighborhoods. And the music was so catching that eventually the music, despite not having access to traditional media channels, became the popular music of the country. And it became a site for experimentation where new sounds would be tested out. People would compete with each other to have the newest sounds, the most innovative sounds. And out of that sound system culture, out of that community music, excuse me, came reggae, came dancehall, came ska, rocksteady, et cetera, et cetera. So the Jamaican music industry is built on community music. The sound system became a socio-political tool, an insistence on presence, but the music was so catching that it attracted producers, DJs, music fans from around the world. And over time, Jamaica became essentially a farm team for new musical genres. And we look at places like London, UK, that built on this community music and sound system culture to create other world-renowned sounds like grime, or drum and bass, jungle, etc. And because it had access to certain power structures and certain resources, it was able to build on that community music spirit and that openness to new sounds and innovation, but also be able to exploit it in a way that they were able to, but also that access to resources enabled them to sustain the music industry. And so I guess I bring that up as a possibility of building on community music, but trying to introduce the idea of, well, how do we, in the face of resources, not take away from that community music spirit, but then still amplify the voices of the community. So I said a lot there, but I was just trying to introduce an example or possibility that exists when those two intersect, because I hesitate to separate the two. I hesitate to think of them as in opposition. And I really want to bring them a bit closer together to see what the possibilities lie in that intersection.
Can I add two pieces of like relevant information? Is that copyright was not existent. Copyright was not enforced in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in Jamaica. So, you know, the amount of governmental interference in terms of policies and procedures, you know, one of the greatest failures of the Jamaican government is that they never invested in their music. They never, ever invested in the music, and the music thrived globally despite lack of government support. So we have arts councils here, we have all kinds of grants, we have all kinds of things. And yet you know, I make my students, I hard press my students to tell me, name 5 genres of music invented in Canada with the 30 million people that we have, versus I could name 5 genres of music invented by 2.5 million people on one island. And that speaks volumes about the role of the government, the role of industry. You know, because there was lots of opportunities to make music in Jamaica. There wasn't lots of opportunities to be sued for sampling. There wasn't lots of opportunities to get ripped off in a record deal kind of thing. So there's a bunch of different variables there that I think, if we think through that example, we ask different questions about the role of policy and the role of government, either in stimulating or controlling. Because the term, you know, copyright is a concept that comes out of Europe. And it's a concept about, quote unquote, protecting writers specifically. But it, again, like most things, it gets co-opted by industry. Even, you know, so industries weaponize copyright and actually prevent people from making things. You know, like Disney copywriting the Happy Birthday song, you know, like that kind of ridiculousness means that community can't thrive in those spaces when governmental policies or industry lenses are hegemonic.
I'd be curious to know, Laura or anybody, are there examples, successful examples where, like Jamaica, there is the free flowing of ideas and community music is stimulating the new ideas that sustain the cultural ecosystem, but at the same time, the people creating these ideas can equally benefit from them, or benefit from them as much as the music industry? Is that possible, or is that a pipe dream?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in, because I was going to say actually maybe two things that respond both to Alana's points and Mark's points. The first being, I think there's an interesting example of, you know, the application of community within the community radio sector, and that's a place where bigger, profitable radio stations give Canadian content development funds to stations to not play hit music, you know, let volunteers on the air. You know, those volunteers aren't necessarily being paid for, or often not being paid for their labor. But if we're thinking of that sort of training ground idea, it could be where you have more ideas circulating that could bleed into more mainstream or profitable channels. And we've been thinking about how we might take that sort of model of diverting funds from, you know, more profitable commercial companies that benefit from monopolies to things like venues that operate with ideas or mandates of communities in place. And maybe that is a sustainability question that, you know, helps them to exist, that isn't tied so much to markets. But I think on the points of copyright as well, something we've been advocating for, and I'll just put two links to two different briefs in the chat here. These are, the first one was to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage Remuneration Models for Artists, and there's links to PDFs in both of those. And in this case, we were really arguing against at this time, what was about to become a reality of copyright term extension in Canada, mirroring what the US has, from life plus 50 to life plus 70, arguing kind of against the ways in which copyright reinforces industry concentration, what this means for smaller scale creators in Canada, and trying to advocate for things like rights reversion automatically taking place after about 25 years. So you may have artists being able to then get their rights back, license them directly, do something else with those rights, and thinking more about communities sort of connected to ideas of public culture. So we get into things like the Creative Commons and user rights and the relationship to Canadian creativity versus sort of the relationship between industry monopolies and upholding what are very much repressive a repressive copyright regime. And the second one is more recent, and this was sent to the Innovation Science Economic Development Canada consultation on the term extension itself. A lot of librarians and libraries were involved in this, very few advocating for sort of the creative sector or musicians. And in this case, this is more of a reaction to the fact that the term extension was going through and thinking about ways to sort of mitigate the ill effects of that. So that one's a little bit less based on music, but it also includes some context with respect to Canadian musicians in COVID at the end there, and things about the political economy of the Canadian music industries as well. But I kind of like that idea about how to bridge communities and industries, and thinking about something like the community radio sector or the campus community radio sector, which has its own issues of sustainability. Commercial stations are after those frequencies and what have you, but it is a place where there is some support for not primarily commercial or market-driven examples of sharing music are able to circulate to some extent, and maybe that is something that we could expand into other realms of the music industries potentially.
Maybe I'll just add something very quickly because everyone has spoken so eloquently on this subject matter. I think that, there needs to be a delineation between industry and community, and I want us to think about the implications of bringing them closer together. And if we're thinking about the transformational, and this is a word that Christina brought up, maybe I can take a cue from something that was recently tweeted by Edmonton's former poet laureate and musician Cadence Weapon. And in this tweet, he reminds us that the most significant, radical, impactful social initiatives in Toronto over the past year were made possible by volunteers. So vax hunters, tiny shelters, community fridges, encampment support network. There's a connection to be made here with music and the possibility of music operating in transformative ways outside of industry frameworks and logics, which we know are primarily, as we've discussed, geared towards extraction and economic activity. These social initiatives that I listed happen outside and despite of industry, and they're oriented towards an ethic of collective community care and are not focused on wealth accumulation. And this is not so much me trying to, resolve anything, but add another dimension to the conversation that we're having.
Thanks so much, everyone, for your really thoughtful exploration of these lines. And thanks, Alana, for bringing the example of Jamaica and the various refinements in this conversation that we were having about this. I'm often struck by the ways that music, comparatively a smaller part of the sort of, entertainment sector of the economy. Again, I know that we're kind of pushing against this kind of economic framing of it, but that I think the way that theorists have for many years, like going back to like Jacques Attali writing in like 1989, talking about music as a harbinger of the future. And I think of the ways that musicians are in some ways harbingers of the experience of neoliberal life and some of the things that we're sort of teasing out here. I want to leave a little space for the audience to engage and ask their own questions and bring their thoughts to this conversation. So I want to think a little bit about, some of, move our conversation maybe a little bit more sort of future oriented, as we've been, many of us have been sort of pushing that conversation. And thinking about, we were talking, I think Mark was the person who said, how do we, where's the radical imagination here? So often in Canadian music policy, I mean, we are so good at sort of mapping out what happens in terms of industry structures. This is where the money comes from. So much of the money, that the granting money, goes to support major labels and often major artists. So there's, we do end up with this very stratified way of thinking about, where the money is and who is participating in music cultures, and these very extractive ways that so often policy and copyright seem to work with musical creativity. And so I guess the way I'll frame this question for the panel before we begin to sort of invite conversations in from the audience, although we have plenty more questions that we would love to talk about, is maybe some examples for musicians and how musicians have sustained themselves. Again, the sustainability, the S word that we are kind of dancing around here on this panel. How have musicians sustained themselves in the pandemic? Are there any examples or hopes going forward with all the caveats that we've been listening? We might also think about the ways that different sort of technological and infrastructure and human affordances, the bodies that are involved in doing this, might limit the potential of those things. How might we think about reversing or pushing against or resisting this extractive, mode that shapes so many lives involved in making music? And, so what kinds of paths forward might we imagine have we seen in this extraordinary and, again, another catastrophe on top of the music industry in many ways that the pandemic has brought? Where's our hope? Where's or maybe radical imagination might be the place.
I got to think this one through. So when y'all go first.
Just quickly, and I mean, I may try to think through some more specific things too, but it seems like there's been a heightened conversation or awareness around things like what an individual or an everyday sort of listener, what their kind of listening habits or practices means for kind of a larger, I don't know, ecosystem of music, for lack of a better term. And maybe the conversation is, there seems to be a focus on having at least this conversation about this being an issue potentially, at least over the last year. I think there's been a spotlight on that.
I'll add something, excuse me, to the copyright conversation, which is not my specialty, but Brian, maybe you have some thoughts on this. I feel like there has to be a conversation about public domain because, Alana, I loved what you said about music coming out of communities, and then and where do we see models of that then connecting to industry. And I should say that I don't see community and industry as separate at all. I think and if that came across in my last comments, then I definitely misspoke. What happens in community music is part of how we make money, which to me is part of an industry. And part of what happens in the field of making money through music is working within community settings. But public domain is often the tag that gets put on music that comes out of communities. And I guess here for me, I'm thinking really specifically about the field of traditional music, which is where most of my research is, and the ways that that say a village in Quebec might have a set of some repertoire that comes out of that location, fiddle tunes or songs, for instance, and that gets tagged as public domain, and then there's no money that goes back to that community or to the individuals who somebody wrote that music. It didn't just appear out of the soil of the town center as much as we might imagine that it did. So how does money get funneled back to groups of semi-professionals or amateurs who are making music and putting that music out into the world? Because with public domain, it tends to not get back, it's funneled back. And I think there's also, I think that public domain also connects to some of these questions we're having around how the industry is, how racial inequity and gender inequity work in the industry, because if we think about music that comes out of amateur music making, that can be gendered at times. If we think about things like music from Indigenous communities, First Nations communities that was recorded and somehow then moves into the public domain, and then you end up with copyright issues around, or I don't want to say copyright issues, I guess sovereignty issues around whose music is this and what does this get used for? But under copyright law, this is in the public domain. I don't have an answer to this, but I feel like that's part of the question here.
I think it's also a question of resources. Like Laura, when you're speaking about artists or communities being remunerated for the music that they produce and create. I mean, I just did my taxes and I forgot to file my MROC T4. Like there are all of these different systems that then get into play that, then require support and guidance around how to then, file your taxes properly and, not have to pay the government back for something that you've missed. I would really love to see in Toronto, we have a library where, people can rent out tools, they can rent out cooking equipment, but it would be amazing if we had a place where people could go and borrow a guitar or a music interface, and then, be given resources on how to use it, like just some sort of borrowing infrastructure that requires no money, that in some way is institutionally supported by the government, that can get people with equipment learning different skills and perhaps providing opportunities that may not otherwise exist. It's a very practical suggestion.
But I think that kind of practicality is useful in the same way that community and industry can exist. I think creativity and practicality, I think they both need each other. And I'm so curious about the intersections of the different perspectives that have come up today. There's so much that I want to say on how artists have sustained themselves, what the future could look like. My initial, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking that we're not sustaining ourselves. We're sustaining society at the cost of ourselves, and there are people over the last year, and I don't want to take away from the hope. There will be hope at the end of this answer, but follow me. When I think about the Unreal Life initiative led by Simone Schmidt that is educating musicians within the community about the systemic racism that led to the creation of the music industry, never mind the systemic racism that emerges, covert and overt forms of racism in the music industry, but the very racist foundation of the music industry. When I think about Club Quarantine, which Casey brought up, which is an online club led by and created for the queer community. I think about my own initiative, Susu, which is a music and conversation series that's meant to bring siloed music scenes together and to raise funds for mutual aid. On the surface of it, it looks like because we are artists presenting and sharing art, we are doing what it is that we're supposed to do. But what you don't see on the other end is that we do not get paid for this time, that we are impacted as greatly by the weight of some of the heavy conversations we're bringing to audiences. And we are also experiencing the hurt that inspired the need for the creation of these initiatives. That's barely surviving, never mind thriving, you know? And so I don't know that we are sustaining ourselves necessarily, but we are getting by. And because we are artists and we share this creative output, society gets to benefit and can feel good. And so the assumption is that we also feel good doing it, and that isn't always the case. But I think going through the different cycles of grief that has to do with realizing that your tours are canceled, that you've lost money, that you're uncertain of your future, in that questioning, I know for myself, I've emerged with a new identity of what it means to be an artist. There's my practice and there's my career. I'm an artist whether the industry collapses or not. I'm a vocalist. I don't need any infrastructure. I don't need any instrumentation. I can sing and I create music simply with my voice, right? And so I think holding on to that power, that idea of a practice that can exist whether radio plays me or not, whether I'm signed or not, whether an audience shows up to my show or not, that feeds me. That's not just a romantic notion, that is a survival mechanism, but it's also a tenet of my identity. I'm an artist, and that's something that I realized last year. But then when I think about my career, I think about the networks that I decide to participate in. I think about the media outlets through which I decide to present my work. I think about the collaborators that I want to collaborate with, and all of those are strategic moves, whether it's thinking about the strategy of how to maintain my practice and the integrity of it, or whether it's thinking about the economic advancement of my practice and turning it into an economically viable part of my my body of work. I think about how the relationship between my practice and the career, and those are considerations that I've sat with as well. And I don't know that I would have been able to, especially because of the fact that I am not 21. I'll tell you that right now. And I've been in the music industry for a long time. I came up in the music industry. So it was hard for me to shed that thinking, thinking like, I know so many people in the music industry, I get music grants, I understand music law, I'm set, I should make it. Why am I not making it? And all that questioning that comes up. And then last year, when I thought about the fact that there is no music industry to tap into at the moment, what do I have left? I have my music practice, and I'm really good at it. I'm just as dedicated to being a good artist as I am to being a good music business person. And so when I think about sustainability, going back to the idea of maintaining myself, and the idea of, rather than thinking about maintaining something, but dismantling something, last year, when I thought about maintaining my emotional health, it meant saying no, rather than taking on opportunities, thinking about my future, and how saying no to the wrong opportunities saved my emotional resources for myself and for my practice. When I think about maintaining myself last year, rather than maintaining my idea, what I think of as being an artist. Actually, Casey shared a reading with me by Angela McRobbie, and there was a chapter called "The Romance of Being Creative," and how we create the illusion of having a creative practice as if we're actually working, when we're just like buying things to mask the fact that we don't really have money, or we're not making money. Like, we're kind of creating this illusion of like a romantic freewheeling independent thinking freelancer, when really it's just like work precarity, and we just eat really good food and drink overpriced cocktails, so we look like we're thriving, but really we're just like getting by. um, so instead of maintaining the illusion of what I consider a successful artist to be, I had to shed that old identity. And all of these things, when I think about maintenance, what if we had an opposite approach? What if we thought about the things that we shed that weren't serving us, and then we rebuild our idea of what a practice or a career could be? And that's what my thinking has been over the last year. And so now I'm less afraid to speak on a panel. I'm less afraid to dive deeper into academic work, because I don't feel like it's separate from my music making. This is all part of it. Um, and I feel like I got very emotional in that last bit. And so I guess if the takeaway would be, when I think about what it is that I'm sustaining and maintaining, I'm considering what it is that I need to shed so that I can maintain myself. And when I think about how artists are sustaining themselves, I think we still have quite a ways to go. And we can't mistake sustaining society with artists sustaining themselves. And we really have to consider the cost that it takes for us to help the audience feel good. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Did you get something from that? Okay.
You're totally making sense, and this whole panel has made me question the localness and the contingency of our definition of sustainability. And I'm not well versed in indigenous thought, but I know amongst the Iroquois Confederacy and this whole notion, they have a notion of 7 generations, which I'm told is Haudenosaunee. When I learned it was Cree at that many years ago. Anyhow, the idea though is that like people take the responsibility to think about the next 7 generations that come after them, which, while I don't know tons about that, when we talk about sustainability in Western culture, it is not as robust. We're as old as we are, we're just now starting to talk about mental health, so that sustainability never ever really included human sustainability, like our own health. It always meant sustaining the economy. So I'm at a point in journeying through what we mean by sustainability, wondering how deeply and how locally conceived is this idea of sustainability, and what could we learn from folks that had sustained the earth for thousands of years. Because we don't ask questions about, if I build this car, what will happen in 7 generations? Will my great grandchildren live in a polluted earth? Like, well, obviously the question is yes, but Henry Ford wasn't asking that when it was all about economy and sort of industry kind of thing. So yeah, I'm ranting, but I'm also just thinking out loud that where we begin with this conversation of sustainability needs to have not just mental health, but wellness at the very, very core of sustaining the earth and humanity, even if it has to be alongside economy and industry, which we can't seem to get away from.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I think what we're really getting at is these things that are sort of harder to get at with sort of like the sort of polished policy levers that we so often talk about. And that I think this, like in many ways, we often talk about when we're teaching, say, music industry or things like that. And like these bigger questions, which I think is, I return to the fact that like we come to this panel as people who, came to music because we loved it, and music as this form of human expression or human right, or, way of being together in this world. And it's, that of course is hard to get at with all those sorts of levers. And I just really value and continuing to think about everything that people have been raising in this conversation, as wacky as it is to be doing in the land of boxes and cyberspace. I'm looking at in the comments and I'm seeing some questions coming in. And so there's Steve Sterlin with a question about Creative Commons and platforms, which I think is maybe where we were getting into, like dancing around a little bit with our conversation about copyright and public domain. And then thanks, Mary Elizabeth Luca, for your question about coming back to Mark's question about the radical imagination. This is a much easier way of framing the question than I framed it. Like, what would be a great environment for music making in the next 10 years from now? And we don't have to figure out how to get there, which is lovely. So I would love to hear folks' thoughts on the panel about, what do we want to get to? And if you have thoughts about Creative Commons, that would be delightful as well.
Oh, well, I was thinking too, if I could, as I was saying, elaborate a bit on my question there, because I think I was a little bit more thinking about and in part inspired by maybe some of the other panelists and stuff that's been discussed at this conference, from even things concerning like Bill C-10-esque ideas and Canadian content platforms, issues around that. Then the two main things I was wondering about is, so if you're familiar with, because I'll just put links quickly in here, these kind of services or these platforms, you could say, and then speaking in this kind of like in COVID context and what I feel like will be a kind of post-COVID context with people being more comfortable with using digital platforms as we've been kind of got used to recently. Whoops. So just the two platforms here, the this like Musiversal and then that Fiverr. So, and maybe people are more familiar with Fiverr, but so, these kind of services, and there's various other ones like Musiversal where you can, have, not sure, but say like 5 music, like you can get your string quartet, like you're making even something for TV or theater or something, and you get a string quartet, or you're making, your original compositions, you send them sheet music. Then it's like you have this Zoom call where, I don't know if there's like a DAW like recorder built in or how it works, but you can, as if you'd be going into a studio with various musicians. And so that would be a big issue, if you're a session musician and you were doing stuff like, 3 days a week, no problem or more. And then now you might be down to 0. So using these kind of platforms, it allows these people to, continue doing that. And then Fiverr, again, you could hire people. But then, as I was asking about Creative Commons, I just find that is a very interesting question around the idea, like, say, folk music, how you can, in like a post Spotify world or something, like make money off of music that is kind of Creative Commons or lacks copyright, and a certain freedom, where it's important maybe to have it be like, keep that folk kind of tradition. But I find an important thing similar to, say, like artworks that are kind of Creative Commons and various things. It's like the person who actually, though, takes their like Hasselblad camera and goes to a gallery or a statue and takes that, difficult to make photo, and then they sell that photo. So I'm just wondering, with the things I just explained, like the platforms and how, kind of continuing on how you were discussing Creative Commons, the idea that, for instance, like shows would be a big part, is that you have these very old traditional things, but then you'd have even these various, well, I'm more from the Windsor area in Canada here, but you have like Corn Fest, Strawberry Fest, and like 5 other harvest oriented festivals like every year, like in Leamington, Windsor, Chatham, this. So you have people who, it's like they make their yearly income going to like 10 festivals in like 2 months, and you have your year income just from doing that. So I was just thinking that what your ideas on platforms like this, and maybe the other question from Mary, how that would look in the future / near future to have, and if you have other models, and Elena, I don't know if you're saying you have models like this, platforms, but platforms that could maybe have, decentralized networks, CanCon rules, whatever that would integrate the stuff I was talking about / moving forward and helping with the stuff we're talking about. So that's my question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'm looking at these platforms, and they look like ways to sort of get session musicians, which is a long-standing practice in the industry. And, there's a lot of questions about, fair pay, intellectual property, and labor coming out of those. But yes, I feel like people on this panel will have a lot to say, so I'm going to get out of the way.
I will say that Musiversal as soon as I see that design aesthetic, I'm like, that's not for me. When I see a site where it's like many quotables by somebody's face, it feels very and I see something that utilitarian. I think it's useful. I think it's an intelligent idea. I think it could be a possible solution, although my experience in voice work, I find that even in the industry, those personal relationships are very important. And so to have kind of like a baseless working relationship, I don't know, I'd be concerned about the quality of the music and the quality of the musical experience that comes from it. I think that people would have the technical capabilities, but I think that interpersonal relationship is very important in creating community music. And so that's where these platforms, I feel, fall short. I think that if I were treating it as a job, that it would be useful, almost like seeing it as a job board. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of, I have an intuitive reaction to that, so it's hard for me to articulate. It's not necessarily off-putting, and I know that I'm critiquing this particular platform rather than the whole idea that you're getting at is like, what are new models of sustainability? What are ways of soliciting music services in face of certain limitations that we have, even spatial limitations, considering that we're in a pandemic and can't be in the same room and can't network. This is a way that you can connect with different musicians. But it also makes me curious about what would the actual musical outcome be of this kind of collaborative working relationship. And that just the kind of romantic artists, that I am, I would hesitate to create music through this kind of platform. But it does get me thinking about, okay, well, how do we create those connections? How do we build a personal relationship if that is the way through which you like to communicate, but at the same time recognize the need for work and recognize the limitations in being able to network, etc. But on a simple level, I feel like Instagram has actually been quite useful for that. I've seen many collaborations pop up through people who have a chance to go to someone's Instagram page, and it sounds kind of basic because it's like, it's just Instagram. Everybody has access to that. Everybody has an Instagram account, but you can, at the very least, even if it's on a superficial level, get a sense of what are the allegiances that these people are communicating through their aesthetic. What's the community that they're rolling with? Does it align with your own personal value system or your own musical interests? You can get samples of their music. You can engage with them in conversation in the DMs. And then you're building these kind of micro communities. And then that may or may not lead to collaboration. And I've seen that happen. And that feels a little bit less, I don't want to be insulted. Sterile is too severe a word, but I just think that that is a way that you can engage in outreach and expand your network in a way that could lead to work, but is on the basis of establishing a relationship, which I think creates more meaningful music, or at least something that feels good because it's less pastiche. You have a way of, there's a little bit more back and forth, and that negotiation of ideas is where I think the most interesting creativity emerges from. So I'd be curious to explore Universal, is that Universal? To see if there's an opportunity to engage with the people and not just their services as well.
Yeah, I think, and that's where I think the aspect that you're sensing and focusing on with Musiversal, that yeah, can seem off-putting is that like, yeah, it seems to be more this almost roster system where it's kind of like, and almost we're getting into problematic record label issues kind of that we're talking, where it's like they'll have their 8 kind of people with their headshots and all their stuff. So it's like, oh, if you need a drummer, you could choose from these 3 drummers and stuff like that, as opposed to more of a social seeming, platform. And then, because that's what I was kind of wondering, almost a bit of a hybrid approach that I think you're really emphasizing there with Instagram. Is that a way to kind of advantage from, well, because then, for instance, like certain issues maybe with Instagram, is then we can get into larger kind of uh, basically kind of, I don't know, problematic use of algorithms and data privacy and integrating like, for profit advertising models into cultural musical production at every level, so that every bit of data you send through, the Amazon web server will create revenue for whatever. So, and that's what I was kind of emphasizing. I think definitely what you're saying, but then focusing on maybe this like decentralized network stuff where, you could integrate those things. And then maybe it would almost look closer to like something like Bumble or something, like almost closer to like a dating app or something, but without certain larger data implications.
Thanks
You know,
so
that-
much, Stephen. I think we have a few, like 3 more minutes left in the panel, and I'd love to give our panelists like 30 seconds to 60 seconds to say anything summative that they would like to say.
I'll start very quickly. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the special issue that I co-edited, because the editorial, the last section of the editorial is what we call the non-policy section for those of you who are interested in policy. But we're looking through all these special issues include largely non-academic writers. So there's like contributions from, I don't know, 50 to 60 people from the industry, musicians, agents, festival directors, so on. And we're trying to sum up some of the ideas. There's so many ideas that come out of their writings. So that's the non-policy section there. So there's some great ideas. I'll put that out, ME. And my other dream for 10 years from now is, I don't know if it's universal basic income or something like what happens in France for, artists on their days off, they actually get paid, like some kind of unemployment, but some kind of sustainable financial structure like that. And pipe dream here that when we hire our local musicians, we pay them as much as we pay the out-of-town musicians, so that you don't have to travel all over the place to make the same amount of money. Okay, I'll pass it on to the next person.
Thanks for that, Laura. I want to wrap up by answering Emmy's. 10 years from now, if I was to radically imagine what this space could look like, I think as radical as I could imagine is having elders from different diasporas be at the policy table with young people, where you might learn about a grandmother from Somalia or a grandmother from Sri Lanka explaining how they sustain their musical career and their love for music, and bring that to bear on what kinds of decisions. Because I feel like the conversation is not complete if it's not intergenerational, multi-sectoral, and outside of academia, as well as including scholars and practicing musicians. So that's my 10-year dream.
Maybe I can add a dream for this summer or next year. I hope we can get out of our houses and get in the room together, because there's nothing that replaces the affective charge of being at a show, playing with musicians and friends in the same room. I have a 3-year-old son that is very into MIA and Frozen, and his experience of music has been limited to screens. And I would love nothing more for him and his pals to see a show outside in a park or at a concert venue again. So I'm hoping for a healthier, safer world. And yeah, that's very idealist right now, but that's actually what I'm hoping for.
And I guess I agree with all those excellent points. And I think one thing I would just add to that too is potentially getting, if we're thinking about the role of the internet and digital spaces, getting to a place where we can think about that as not being connected to corporations so much. We're thinking about platforms, Instagram, Spotify. It's hard to imagine an internet that doesn't have those connections, even though the technologies themselves should allow for more direct relationships between artists and fans, and maybe compensation starts to play out across those lines where people are less dependent on a restricted set of structures, and it's less about slim percentages to artists and more about more substantial payments, so that people can explore creativity in a wide variety of ways, and kind of using technology to its fullest potential.
I mean, I would love for this to happen now, but we're speaking specifically about musicians and artists, but this applies to everyone. Is I would love universal basic income to recognize the value that we're contributing to society, and that we don't have to continually have to prove our contributions in quantitative data, but that the pandemic can highlight the initiatives that we've contributed in upholding society, and that we could be compensated accordingly, so that we can continue to do what we're doing. We can create, we can inspire, we can comfort, we can challenge, but in a way that doesn't completely deplete us, and so that we can make creative decisions not based on chasing money or the compromises attached to certain kind of money, but that we can make creative decisions for the purpose of making as strong a musical practice as we can. And I would say that I dream of a Canada where we don't have to leave to go to the States or Europe to be signed or to be promoted or for our music to be recognized. That we have a Canadian music industry or community that recognizes the innovation that we have within this country, and that we value new ideas, and that we're less risk averse, because we already have the ingredients. We just need to support what it is that we have here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, panelists. This was, Mark, Laura, Brian, Casey, and Alana. I love the vision of all musicians with UBI, actually all people with UBI, to be honest. Elders at the table, getting to not having to leave and travel, taking some of the lift of touring off, which has become such an important way for musicians to make a living, and it's so hard on so many people. And then an internet without corporate domination. So we're just very simple requests. But I really love this world that we're imagining. And please do check out the fabulous work that folks are doing in their scholarship, in their music making, in their engagement with the community. And thanks, everybody. So thanks for coming, and thanks to the panelists. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.